I found that deeply soothing somehow. Anyway, over to you, Bruce. So yes. Thank you for doing this evening. Thank you for joining us. So let's just thinking about, what do we need to consider when thinking about Indigenous peoples in our neighborhoods, particularly thinking about those who are not particularly churchgoers. So that'd be really good to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me introduce myself in the traditional way, and then I'll say a little bit about where I think we should go, and then talk a little bit, and then take questions and maybe talk a little bit more. We'll see how the time goes. So, Sego, Deogena de Yangyat, Ganyan Kahaga, Niio Kwaganyat. Sego is just hello or greetings. Deogena de is the name. I really like the way it was described to me. It's the name that you would wear around your necks. So envision a lanyard. If I were in my own community, Deogenade is how I would be known. It translates as his bright fire. Ganyankahaga is my nation. You know it as Mohawks. We call it people of the Eastern Door. And my particular family is from Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte in near Belleville, Deseronto, and Tyendinaga. The last piece, Waganyatan, is my clan, which is the Turtle Clan. In Mohawk culture, there are three clans: wolves, bears, and turtles. Each has some specific purposes and jobs and responsibilities. Turtles tend to be the talkers, so we'll see where that takes us. I appreciate the invitation, Ian, and it's good to be with you all this evening for a little bit. I think the first thing I'd like to say is I live in Guelph, and in this small community, we know there are about 4,000 Indigenous people. Most of them are living quiet lives. They don't make waves, they're not visible. Especially those of us who can pass as white, it's really easy to just blend in as much as we can. And quite frankly, until recently, there were very few reasons to self-identify. Those younger members of our community who have children, then with the school system, there are certain benefits to self-identify. But by and large, a lot of the community will just stay quiet unless they get riled up about something. So if there's somebody who wants to jump in with a question, feel free to do so. I'm more used to an interactive than talk and talk. So if something I say invites a question or a thought, jump in. So that would be my first point. You may have people within your congregations or communities, and you just don't know they're there. How do you welcome them in if you don't know they're there? Do the usual things that we always do. I heard talk about dogs being a welcoming. Sure, there are lots of ways. I remember when I returned to church after a roughly 25-year sabbatical. When I came back, within a month, somehow I'd ended up on the coffee team and the welcoming group. So don't don't rush quite that quickly, but do make room for engagement. I'm not sure. In some places, the narthex can have welcoming symbols and signs. One is just use a little bit of the local Indigenous languages. In the Niagara, you're pretty safe using Anishinaabemowin and Haudenosaunee. Beyond that, start to, as you find people, begin to build relationships. In Guelph, there is no friendship center, no gathering place for Indigenous people. And often, in at least pre COVID, we used a United Church and an Anglican church as gathering places in the basement. Unfortunately, that also meant that we eliminated a certain element of the population because they just aren't comfortable in churches. Residential schools have still intergenerational impact. It's going to take some time and some careful consideration as to how you break down barriers without denying the reality of what has happened. Um, I think that's going to be a huge challenge. It certainly is in my community. In Hamilton, you have a couple of active Indigenous organizations. Take advantage when they put on events that are for the whole community. Attend, just be an ally, be present. It's one of the things that we really need. Um, I'll digress a little bit and tell a short story. On the weekends, a Saturday afternoon, uh, the firekeepers in Guelph um, were a very small group who have a special role in ceremony of tending fire. We invited the larger community for a teaching fire, and we spent almost 2 hours talking about the fire, why we have fire, what we do. I won't go into the details except to say 40 people came out to hear us and mingle with us, to learn about the medicines. Some were city staff, some were people who lived in that particular community and knew the fire was around, and others, it was their first experience. That any event, whether it be a powwow, um, a marketplace, uh, just anything that's a social event that's open to the larger group, but being respectful as well. We put up signs when it's just the Indigenous community, and we still get a little bit of traffic that comes a bit too close, and we're negotiating with the city just to expand our safe zone. That's another area. Dogs aren't welcome in the sacred fire sites, so we've had to do some negotiating because the park, the sacred fire, is inside a city park. Let me see. Yeah, I've talked about those. I talked about space. One of the questions, Ian, that you asked was there a role for reaching out as Christians to, especially the unchurched? There may be. I would. I'm walking in two paths. I'm walking in the Anglican faith, but I'm also walking with the seven grandfathers, an Anishinaabeg tradition. And those two can walk hand in hand. There may be other aspects of Indigenous spirituality that might not mix so easily. But if you think of words like love, truth, humility, respect, honesty, love, wisdom, I can go back and forth between what I understand from an Anishinaabe spirituality and how I work with those grandfathers to saying, I recognize wisdom in some of the wisdom work, and I honor the women who are mentioned in those wisdom stories. Love, pretty universal. Here in Guelph, there's a multi-faith group, and whether they're Muslim, Hindu, Baha'i, Unitarian. Those words all resonate. So there are places where you can start from a common understanding, and whether you want to speak more to the Christian tradition, well, of course you can. But I would make space for both. And I remember, oh, probably 15 years ago, doing that at St. Matthias. Now, some of you may think of St. Matthias when it existed as being a bit of an outlier to Anglicanism, but we still, uh, Elizabeth sat on one side of the altar, one end actually. I sat at the other, and we traded stories, uh, following the seven grandfathers, with Elizabeth responding with a story from either the Bible or her own experience as a Christian. So you can do things like that that bring the two together in a good way so that Indigenous people hear a respect for their own ways of understanding creation. I think that's the critical piece, is respect. The other critical piece would be reciprocity. When we go out as Indigenous people, we often look for signs of reciprocity. So tonight, if we had been in person, Ian might have offered me a twist tie filled with enough tobacco to fill a pipe bowl. And that would have been in exchange for whatever I was able to offer the group. When I'm at the fire, if I want one of the other firekeepers to do a particular task that's a bit onerous, out of the ordinary, I would offer them tobacco. Or I might offer them a small token. When the young lads, we have a couple of 11-year-olds who think they someday may want to be firekeepers. I like to have a little button that with the Anishinaabe greeting, Ani, or the Haudenosaunee Sago on the button, and the 4 direction colors in the background. I'd offer them something like that, just a little token of reciprocity for whatever little bit of work they've done around the fire. I've probably rushed through that. So why don't we take a few questions? It'll give me a chance to flesh out anything that it wasn't clear or that you'd like to delve into a little bit more.
So questions, clarifications? Just unmute and ask directly. Go for it, Sheila.
Could you just explain, Bruce, a bit more about the fire keepers?
Yes. Firekeeping is an Anishinaabe tradition. I said I was Mohawk, but I need to go back a little bit and say it was in the relatively recent past that I learned about my Indigenous heritage when I was in my late 60s. And so, of course, the first thing I did was reach out to the grandmothers in the Mohawk communities. They were not terribly responsive for a number of reasons. So I looked closer to home, and in Guelph, there were no Mohawk or Haudenosaunee elders, but there were some very wise women who were Anishinaabeg and Métis, and they offered me teaching. So this is becoming the norm for urban Indigenous peoples. You take the elders who are present in your community and you adapt. So my teachings are primarily Anishinaabe. So within that, there are men have the responsibility for fire. Women have the responsibility for water. And we tried to hold those two in balance. So our fire site is right beside the Speed River in downtown Guelph. The firekeepers use the fire as a way of communicating. If you've ever looked into a fire and where it's white hot, that in some understandings is an opening to the spirit world. And if you can look in, the fire can look out and look at you. And so you build a relationship with the fire, mostly by sitting, contemplating. We have 4 sacred medicines: tobacco, which is used as a medium for prayer; sage, which is used as a cleansing; cedar, which can be both cleansing and healing; and then sweetgrass, which is often considered a woman's medicine, but can be used by both sexes. And again, mostly for comfort and healing. So we would sit at the fire. The firekeepers are responsible for lighting the fire, for maintaining it, and for the safety of anyone who comes to the fire. We are having some interesting discussions about what do we do with people with addictions who need the fire for healing, but maybe a danger to themselves and to the fire if they're intoxicated. We're working through those. It's a real challenge. The other challenge is, I said it was men's, but there are some women who desperately want to be firekeepers. Are we inclusive or are we exclusive? Do we stick with the local tradition or do we become more open? That's been the last 2 years of conversations around the fire. The other thing firekeepers do is they hold those fires for specific purposes. So the 2 equinoxes, the 2 solstices, often at sunrise, when we have capacity, enough bodies to do it, we will run the fire till sunset on those days. If we don't have capacity, then we run it for two hours, perhaps 2 hours at sunrise, and then regroup and do it again for an hour in the evening for those who are working but still need to come to the fire. When there are special days, June 21st, National Indigenous Peoples Day. In September, Orange Shirt Day. October, Sisters in Spirit. Those days, we make sure that the fire is available. It's a place the Indigenous community will come and offer their prayers. I said we use tobacco. Think of it as a medium. The tobacco, offering the tobacco to the fire is not the prayer. The prayer is whatever intent you hold in your heart and then put into the fire via the tobacco. And then that smoke rises to heaven. Yeah, we're still in the heaven is up there stage, but
Okay.
that's the way it is. The last piece for your question, the last important firekeeping is done in transitions for a newborn and for the death of anyone in the community. Traditionally, the death fire lasts 4 days. And that can be problematic when we're down, as we are at the moment, to 5 firekeepers. It's a real stretch to last 4 days, especially in the winter. Last time we did it, it was -20 in February. And it was a challenge. But you do it because you do it out of love for your community, and in this case, love for the elder whose child had passed. I could go on, but I think that gives you the idea of how important firekeeping is as an element of my life, at least. Other questions?
Bruce, you mentioned that the men's fire is responsible for obviously fire, and that the women were responsible for water. Is that what I understand is the clan mothers, or is there am I misinformed there?
There's another element to clan mothers, but generally, any ceremony around water, such as I'm not sure where you are, Nancy, but if you're anywhere along the Grand, there's a Grand River water walk every year. There's a walk, a few years ago, Grandmother Josephine did a walk around the Great Lakes. I forget how many times she actually did it, but it was more than once, around all 5. So that responsibility is for the women. And I talked about balance. In my community, the women have been strong for 50 years, the men much less so. We're just starting to get our act together and coming together as men. And it's interesting that the University of Guelph did some research, and they found that the mental health of men, Indigenous men, especially urban Indigenous men, was much improved if they attended fire on a regular basis. So, yeah. Jean, a question, or just I saw your name light up.
No, I guess what I was asking is a firekeeper, is that a calling, or are you selected, or is it a birthright, or like how did? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, and a really good one. It's a calling.
Okay.
One of my firekeeper brothers is not Indigenous, but he felt called to the fire 25, 30 years ago. So he's been doing it much longer than me. And a Métis firekeeper recognized something within him, encouraged him, sat with him, and mentored him. And he tells the story that one weekend he was supposed to help the firekeeper at a sweat lodge. And early in the morning, he got a phone call saying, "You're on your own, Ron.
Well,
You're ready. Go and do it." And that was when he became a firekeeper.
wow.
Yeah, we all have stories of that moment when, with a bit of trepidation, we're doing a fire that we haven't done before. So that's another case at sweat lodges and at powwows. There's almost always a sacred fire. Mm-hmm.
How long is the training? Like I'm getting stuck on the fire part of it, but I'm finding this intriguing. Like
The training is you find a firekeeper who has the energy and the space and the time to sit with you, and you just observe. The first 6 months that I was with the 2 different firekeepers, I just watched. And if they said go and fetch, I went and fetched. And that was as close to the fire I ever got. And then eventually it was come do you've seen how we tidy up, go and tidy. Then eventually it was down to the point where would you like to help light this fire? And then it was after that, it's techniques and what do you do when? So at a powwow, you might get the whole range, and you need to be able to tease out those who really need the fire. So a dancer, especially a jingle dress dancer, getting ready to go into the arena, you would smudge her and let her sit quietly at the fire so that she is ready to take her dance, which is a healing dance, into the community. and you might ask someone else just to wait, give that dancer a few moments of solitude at the fire. So it's a lifelong learning.
So can anyone approach the fire?
Sorry. I just wanted to ask another question. We'll come back to fire in a minute, but I just wanted the other thing. Could you say a bit more, Bruce, about the grandfathers? And I think that's fascinating. I think there's something about this. Is it the 7 grandfather teachings? I'll be really interesting to hear. And do young Indigenous people know this spirituality? I'm intrigued to know. Sorry, Dean. We'll come back to fire in a minute, but I just wanted to ask that question.
Yeah. I am currently teaching the 7 grandfathers in the world religion classes at grade 11 in the high schools. And some of the Indigenous youth are very familiar, practice it themselves. Others, it's brand new because there's that gap that was caused by both the residential schools and the 60s scoop. So there's information. If you think back, 1950s and 60s, anything like that was illegal. In fact, a gathering of more than 2 Indigenous people was illegal. So there are gaps in our knowledge. There's stuff we think we know, but we're not really sure. Having said that, the 7 grandfathers, I was introduced to them by several different elders. And then there's a couple of books that have been written. One by Dave Chartrand is extremely good. So I'm going to add another little piece that will eventually answer your question. Back in the 90s, attending St. Matthias, we did a week of guided prayer. And during that time, we had a number of guest speakers. One of them was a Jesuit from Ignatius at the north end of Guelph. And he came in and talked about the examen. And he described it as an evening prayer where he would ask himself, where was God in my life today? And he would review his day, looking for those glimpses of the Spirit, the Creator. And then he would just put it aside, sleep, and know that the next day was a new gift. I recalled that after I'd heard the grandfather teachings and thought, if I were to ask the question, it would be, how did I walk with the grandfathers today? Was there one I spent too much time with? Was there one I spent too little time with? Did I hold those 7 in balance? And so there's a long story that describes how the grandfather teachings came into being. And because I like teaching, I decided that I would use a little bit of the animal spirit that's recognized with each of these truths, but I would also use it in a story. So if I can give you a quick example, the first teaching is humility. And I have a lump of coal I picked up in Kentucky many years ago when my children were quite young. And I had convinced the family that we absolutely needed to see the mound city of Cahokia in southern Illinois. And so we drove off in a rather old station wagon with 2 young kids and soon discovered that one of them got car sick. So a little bit of humility. In fact, this coal was picked up in Kentucky during one of those unexpected but very necessary pit stops on the side of the road. Arriving near St. Louis, the catalytic converter broke and fell off the car. When we arrived at a Jesuit retreat center, Our Lady of the Snow in St. Louis, I had phoned ahead and made sure they accepted campers. And they looked at us and said, "Where's your motorhome?" And humility struck again when I said, we have a tent. And they said, oh, well, the Welcome Center closes at 8, but we'll reopen at 8 in the morning. I looked at the two kids and thought, oh dear, I hope there are bushes. On the way home, the battery died in the car. We crossed the border at Buffalo with pocket change, enough to pay the toll, get back to Canada. And we stopped in St. Catharines, where my parents lived, and we went to the bank of mom and dad. There I was in my mid-40s saying, Dad, can you loan us a bit of money? I don't get paid till the third week in September, and we haven't bought the kids anything for school yet. So humility. And I have 7 stories and 7 grandfathers. And with each one, there's a stone from a different part of Turtle Island. Do you want the 7?
Yeah, it's not in your call.
I'll see how good my memory is. Humility with the wolf. Love is the eagle. Wisdom is the turtle. Truth is a difficult one. It's with Sabe, which you might know as the Sasquatch. Respect. Courage. How's that? 6. Which one have I? Honesty. 7. The honesty and truth. And those 2 are problematic because I think of it as the truth piece as being in 2 aspects. There's universal truths, and then there are individual truths. And we could spend an evening chatting about those, I'm sure. Other questions?
I have a question, Bruce. Thank you so much for your teaching and for sharing the grandfathers with us. So we've been talking a lot about engaging community. Like, what does it mean? How do we move outside of our churches and be with people? And in what I've heard you say, it's like the Indigenous, there's many Indigenous communities, but the Indigenous community, the urban Indigenous community that you belong to and that many people belong to, has had to learn how to engage with one another again and like build relationships and be connected. And I'm just wondering if you could talk or share a little bit about, like, what does relationship building look like and mean in your community? I hear a lot about a ritual, sacred practice being a part of what brings you together. I hear storytelling and deep listening and mentorship, but if you could just, share with us a little bit about what does like engaging your community look like? What is central to that?
That's difficult. A few years ago, I counted 19 different nations represented in Guelph.
Mm.
So if some of those nations have very similar practices, but if you meet someone from Wet'suwet'en, you're going to hear a very different creation story than those of the Anishinaabe, the Algonquin, and the Mi'kmaq. So somehow we have to get to that point where we can be comfortable with a variety of ceremonies and simply say, we are on land that is the treaty land of the Mississaugas, the traditional land of Wendat, Huron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee. And so we respect, but we also try to open up the circle to as many ways of honoring our spirituality. Ceremonies, yeah. A few years ago, pre-COVID, we got together in a bookstore. They loaned us space once every couple of months for a Sunday afternoon. And we would bring in a storyteller if it was winter, because that's the storytelling time. In the spring, we might bring in a teacher who could talk specifically on an aspect. But we didn't have, and still don't have, a place to be on the land. And that makes it difficult because so much of what we do is land-based. So even though we're in a very wide open city park for the fire, we can do a few things at that fire, but we can't do everything. And so we have to connect with people, and we do have. There's a lovely farm family north of Guelph who gave us part of their sugaring off bush to use for ceremony. So it's well away. It's in the back part of their farm. So again, it's building those connections and bridges. And that came about because they were at the Guelph farmers market every Saturday. And some Indigenous people made a habit of stopping at that market, buying, getting known, and eventually the conversations led to, we really need a place where we can do ceremony without feeling like we're in a zoo. The offer was made, accepted, and there's some reciprocity. So, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Mm-hmm. Nancy, were you? You're muted.
Sorry, I was just adjusting my glasses.
Okay. Anyone else? Or shall we go back to Jean?
Well, Bruce, I had one question about thinking that lots of people here come from parish churches, and just to take what Emily said, if parish churches, lots of our parish churches have become quite disconnected from their neighborhoods, and we've been looking at how they reach different people groups. What sort of advice would you give those who are involved in parish churches that were wanting to connect with Indigenous people, with all the stuff with, as you say, about residential schools and with all the negativity, understandable negativity with the terrible violence and things that have been done? How do parish churches start to think about engaging with people in their neighborhoods who are Indigenous?
Partner with groups that are already doing good work. Again, I'll give it a Guelph example. We have a small group of younger people mixed with some older who come into and use the church kitchen to prepare food on the weekend. And then they deliver it to another group called The Bench, who occupy a bench in downtown Guelph, and the homeless and those who have food security issues tend to gather at the bench, and then that food is distributed on the 2 days when the usual food resources aren't open. So we have Hope House and Royal City Mission in the downtown core, which offer meals Monday through Friday, but no hot meals on the weekend. And so the kitchen bees, as they call themselves, do that intermediary step, and they're discovering a good portion of those people that they meet on the street are Indigenous. So partnering with a group that already has built up trust, and then find what are the gaps that you can fill in as a parish. Even a small parish can do some really good work. If you don't have a good kitchen, maybe there's a volunteer at a place where they're off serving food. Get known as those are people that we can trust. Even the police department is doing very similar work, where they've because they're on the street, they know a lot of those downtown people. They're now calling other agencies. So in our region, And you have something very similar in Niagara, farther south, NPAAMMB. Forget what stands for, but it would be similar to SOAHAC, Southwestern Ontario Aboriginal Health Access Center. Long word, but it's a group that part of it is primary care health. Part of it is making sure there are social activities that Indigenous people can attend. There's a piece that looks at food security and insecurity. There's another group that's helping those who are underhoused get affordable housing. And sometimes there's two groups that are actually working now to develop supportive housing. So there are different avenues, and you have to find the one that works for your community.
And Bruce, because a lot of what we've been talking about, that often the church feels comfortable doing some sort of social need-based engagement. And a lot of what we've been talking about is how to build friendships again, how to reestablish friendships and to connect with people, not just in some form of social need, but in a sense of reconnection with those who live and work in a parish neighborhood. So if a parish church was wanting to build friendships with Indigenous people, not necessarily in social need, what sort of things should the parishes be thinking through in terms of how to listen, how to engage with Indigenous people who may live in their neighborhoods, where we don't want some sort of just a food bank type relationship, but something that was a bit more, I don't know, humanizing and real friendship? Do you know what I mean? So I just wonder if you have some thoughts about that.
That's a really tough one, because you're going to have to become known and trusted first. And that probably means going to them wherever they might be gathered, rather than expecting you will suddenly have a cohort of Indigenous showing up. And that's a tough one. I think it's going to very much depend on the people in your community, how willing they are to stretch themselves. Going to depend on the community, where it is. Some communities will have a larger number of Indigenous people, and much will depend on which larger community. For instance, Niagara on the Lake and St. Catharines and Fort Erie have very strong friendship centers, and I'm sure there could be relationship building there, because there's a gathering place for Indigenous people. Guelph, as I said, is not so fortunate. We have some real issues, and no matter where you are, you're going to have to be aware of the possibilities of lateral violence. It's very real, and some community leaders have been attacked for either not being Indian enough, not having lived on the reserve, any number of excuses. And so they're reluctant to take leadership in a venture that they're unsure of where it's going to go or what it's going to result in.
Thank you. I think that is part of the challenge, isn't it? Just thinking that it is this sort of re-engagement piece between church, parish church, and neighborhood is really challenging. And
no easy answers.
No.
I feel like some of the advice you gave earlier, Bruce, about going where when opportunities for settlers are available, is like a good way to start. So if there are lots of powwows, or sometimes there's even courses, like I took a couple Indigenous beading courses taught by elders that were open to anybody in Hamilton.
Right.
And it was, yeah, I think there's increasingly opportunities where we show up places instead of expecting, like, which is what this whole course is about, instead of expecting people to come to us, when there actually is an opportunity for us to go and be a part of something even if it's just on the very peripheries. Part of what we're talking about in this course is Christians not being the center of the attention or the world, or the come to us, the church at the center, instead of being people who go out and develop friendships. So I just see so many opportunities. I mean, I'm in Hamilton, so maybe there's a bit more with Six Nations being so close by and different opportunities, but there's so many things that you can participate in even as a settler now. It's quite a gift, actually, for to
Yes.
have harmed so badly but be welcomed to into community in some way. It's yeah, it's quite a gift and quite miraculous in some ways.
That reminds me of the last 3 years in Guelph. There's been we have a number of neighborhood groups that do good work, but they're not Indigenous, but they may have Indigenous membership. But one of the groups holds a Christmas artisan and arts display and sale. And they use a little hall that used to be a school. So get 25, 30 vendors. And I always encourage my friends, come, you keep supporting a local economy. We have some talented artists who just love to tell about why they do what they do. You know, for $20 of buying, say, a few art cards, and you're supporting a family, but you're also learning a little bit about why does my friend Peter make that type of art? What is it? What is his story? And he'll share parts of his story. And you do that over a 2-hour period on a Saturday morning in November, and part of your Christmas shopping is done. You come away having made those first connections, and then you tell people about what a good time you had. It can build. And maybe at some point you say, oh, do you need a different space this year? Here's the church hall.
Thanks, Bruce. I think we've got one. Let's take this as our final question and give Bruce time to answer, and then we will, at the end of this, take a break. But let's take this as our last question. So go for it, Nicola.
Nicola?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm quite curious that being an Indigenous people, how do you encounter Christianity and how to shape your identity for both?
Well, I grew up as a cradle Anglican, and for a good part of my life, my mother assured us that we were Irish, Black Irish. So I came at it from a very different aspect. I left, there were a number of things that happened, but my wife and I went north in the early 70s, and we saw stuff in the north that we were not prepared to see. And our reaction was, where is God in all of this? We didn't have very good answers. So we took a sabbatical, and it was actually one of our children singing in a choir that happened to sing in a church that brought us back in the late 80s. And then we did some shopping and said, well, we were both Anglican at one time. Maybe that's the place to reconnect. And it worked out for us. Then in the early 2000s, when I learned about my Indigenous heritage, as I said, with the 7 grandfathers, it was a case of, can I walk both paths with integrity, or do I have to give one up to follow the other? So far, the path is wide enough. I won't guarantee it'll keep that way, but at the moment, I've had tremendous support from parish priests who have honored Indigenous spirituality and recognized the commonalities instead of talking about the differences. And I think if we keep doing that, we will make more friends.
Thanks, Bruce. And thanks for coming to us quite last minute. We really appreciate all that you shared with us. So just in terms of if people wanted to follow up to think about this more deeply, are there particular resources that people can turn to that you would recommend?
Yes. If you haven't done the blanket exercise, that's a really good resource. Deirdre can set that up, Deirdre Pike. If you have a congregation that's maybe not quite ready for that, the mapping exercise that's done through PWRDF is very good. I'm slightly biased. I say it's the settlers' viewpoint of what happened more than the Indigenous, but again, it's that entry point. The University of Alberta has a MOOC, an online course that's free, 8 modules, excellent material. Those would be, there's some really good reading lists. If there were 2 that I'd recommend, one would be 23 Things You Didn't Know About the Indian Act, and the other is Indigenous Rights with a W by Chelsea Vowell, which covers the Indian Act, treaties, language, a good overview of everything you'd want to know without getting bogged down in detail. She's a Métis lawyer and writes with great clarity. I usually have that book in my bundle when I'm going out to schools or churches.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. This has been incredible. I think you're really helpful just to open up this subject. I'm sure. And are you happy for people, if people have got particular questions, are you okay for people to contact you if they had
Absolutely. You have my email. If you want to either feed them through or distribute my email, just be aware that from mid-March to mid-April, I am bird watching far, far away.
Sounds fantastic. Okay.
All right. Take care, everyone.
That's really, really lovely. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce.
Good
Thank
night.
you. Good night.
So everybody, shall we take a quick 5-minute break? Come back just a little after 8. Yeah, so let's come about 2 minutes past 8.
Okay.
Time to make a quick cup of tea and see you at 2 minutes past 8.